Good morning, everyone. If you could please take your seats. Good morning to all. Thank you for being here. I'm Jonathan Lawrence, director of the center, the Clough Center for the Study of Constitutional Democracy at Boston College, and I am so pleased to welcome you for the first full day of our spring symposium on journalism and democracy. To those here in the audience and those following online, the Clough Center has been addressing aspects of this theme all year. We began in September with a kickoff event on renewing journalism and restoring democracy to frame the conversation, and our speakers included Columbia journalism scholar Michael Schudson, CNN anchor Jim Acosta, as well as WBUR host Tiziana Deering. And in the months that followed, our student fellows continued to reflect on the questions raised during that event in regular seminars. They conducted original research into the issues, drawing on their own disciplinary expertise and interests, and you can find the fruit of their efforts in the new issue of the Clough Journal, which you found in your tote bags, or which you can also download from our website. So this symposium is really the culmination of our exploration of these themes. We hope to keep deepening these conversations, to take stock of current debates and review potential paths going forward. It is thrilling to have so many top journalists and scholars of media and politics in one place. Last night, Jamel Bowie got us off to a great start. Today and tomorrow promise to be full of more fascinating encounters. This is my first year as director, and why, in a place, one might ask, dedicated to the study of constitutional democracy, have we chosen to focus our attention on journalism? Well, one premise is that the news media represent a foundational cornerstone of any successful democracy. And in particular, they make possible a public sphere, that realm of shared communication where public opinion is formed, where the deliberation that drives democracy forward takes place. Journalists inform citizens on the issues that affect them, provide them with the information they need to make sound decisions. And by enabling diverse parties within society to communicate with each other, they also reinforce and give meaning to the constitutionally guaranteed freedom of speech. And through their investigative roles, the media hold the powerful to account, providing a critical line of defense against abuses of power by the state or corporations or other organizations that might dominate in our societies. So there is good reason that journalism is referred to as the fourth estate, and in fact it plays such a wide variety of roles in our democratic ecosystem that we might describe it even more as an element of the democratic air that we breathe. Of course, the exact roles played by the media in democratic societies are highly contested, and their role has changed significantly over time. In their recent book on the paradox of democracy, Zach Gershberg, one of our participants today, and Sean Illing write that, quote, "The history of democracy is the history of communicative innovation, disruption, and adaptation," end quote. During what Benedict Anderson called the era of print capitalism, media institutions helped forge a sense of shared identity in the modern nation states that were coming into being. And this dynamic may have reached its zenith in the era of territorial broadcasting, and yet the revolutionary changes in government and in journalism itself, not least because of the innovations in how news is delivered, have complicated this picture. After cable, after satellites, but especially since the internet, the once ritualized collective consumption of information has changed beyond recognition. In place of that collective experience about shared institutions, shared concerns, news sources are increasingly self-curated and catered. And in this world of search engines and algorithms, there are few shared channels. Now, the changes we've witnessed have certainly not been all to the bad. As in other realms, one should beware nostalgia for the good old days. The entry barriers to the public sphere are much different now, which means less gatekeeping, more flourishing of new voices. We're a far cry from the world of a small group of newspaper and broadcast station owners controlling the marketplace of ideas. And in place of a paternalistic establishment, we have greater newsroom diversity and reporting teams that reflect the communities and issues that they cover. Still, there can be no denying that recent transformations in media and in democracy have precipitated a crisis in both. Within the US, for example, we've lost over 2,000 local newspapers in the last 2 decades, something that Jamel and Heather discussed last night. With the expansion of news deserts has come enhanced vulnerability to disinformation. And the loss of local papers, as one of our participants, Josh Dar, has written about, also correlates with the rise of cynicism and polarized political views. Meanwhile, as we lose traditional institutions of journalism, new forms of media exacerbate the problems left in their wake. So we see how conspiracy mongering on social media can undermine the basic sense of a shared reality within the body politic. And this is often less reflective of ideological divides than of a cleavage between tribes, which keep their own counsel and are impervious to new information. Increasingly, this polarization fosters an asymmetrical distrust. 50 years ago, those on the right and left had similar levels of confidence in the press and TV news. Now, nearly 80% of those on the left say they trust national news outlets, but the same is true of only 35% of those on the right. So such attitudes are reflective of greater trust gaps in institutions as providers of factual information. But this is not a simple story of one ideological audience failing to comply. It is a symptom of the greater shortcomings of meritocracy, something that Jan-Werner Müller calls a general failure of intermediary institutions becoming more associated with the privileged. So in the midst of all of this, politicians take advantage of the loss of trust in the media and actively make it worse. Thus, the leader of one of our main 2 parties openly disdains journalists and fomented an insurrection fueled by the spread of misinformation, and now threatens to do so again. Another contender has based his entire political identity on countering what he calls the false narrative of the news media. And the dynamic I am describing is hardly confined to the United States. The same illiberal discourse can be heard in the Houses of Parliament across Europe, from Berlin to Budapest to Rome, with real-world consequences for everything from fundamental rights to quality of internal democracy, from EU membership to the willingness to criticize human rights violations in China or Russia. They reflect growing features of democratic life that will not fade anytime soon. 2 recent traumas revealed the dire consequences of our intertwined crisis of journalism and democracy. First, the global pandemic, and second, the populist revolts that have shaken many countries. Looking back at the worst of COVID-19, there was a clear connection between the spread of disinformation and public health outcomes in any given area. And given the scale of loss of life, this alone might have weakened any impulse to view this as a merely figurative threat. Yet the pandemic also exposed the harsh reality that news outlets face economic imperatives that make them uninterested in distinguishing truth from lies. As Shoshana Zuboff has argued, media giants are positively incentivized to splinter shared reality, poison social discourse, and paralyze democratic politics. We saw an even more threatening manifestation of this problem unfold in the national capitals of some of the world's most significant democracies. In 3 consecutive years, riotous mobs, first formed online, proceeded to attack the seats of government, of the real world. First to storm the Bundestag in Germany, then the US Capitol on January 6th, and most recently, of course, the state institutions in Brazil. And although the worst of the pandemic and these 3 moments of insurrection are behind us, the larger problems they revealed are very much alive. Since so many within our societies now inhabit different information universes, we face an ongoing battle of interpretation over even how to make sense of these episodes, over the basic facts at hand. In the first years of COVID, did our leaders strike a sound balance between personal freedoms, the economy, and public health? Or more pointedly, was what we witnessed on January 6th a planned insurrection, or just a touristic visit gone awry? In the court of public opinion, it seems, social media and news media can be more decisive for political outcomes than even the justice system itself. So in the face of these pressing, complex problems, one of the most urgent tasks facing us is to better understand what is going on. And if our democracies are to survive, we need fresh thinking on how to respond to these interlocking crises in our journalistic and political institutions. Some of these institutions must come from within the media themselves, and they may require reconceiving some of the ideals and norms and practices that have long guided the profession of journalism. Take the long-established standard of objectivity, which came up in last night's discussion. What does it mean in the age of misinformation and polarization? Does it still hold up? Providing critical, neutral information to voters matters immensely, of course. After all, only in a country where public opinion has no idea of the size of national minorities or the status of immigrants is it easy to make the claim that millions of votes were wrongly cast. But should journalists exceed the mission that Carl Bernstein defined as the search for the best obtainable version of the truth? Do they need to go further to actively protect democracy? It is a variation of the liberals' dilemma in a nutshell, where by sticking to certain principles, you risk playing a role in your own demise. Still, not all potential solutions will come from within the media alone. Can we imagine a role for regulation, for institutional reforms, for enforcing antitrust law, or devising new philanthropic schemes to alter the profit motive? By engaging in these exchanges, can we glean insights that will improve the conditions of 21st century constitutional democracy? Well, we have here the top scholars and preeminent practitioners to examine these and more questions, and I'm confident that the discussions will leave us with a greater sense of how to restore trust in the news media that undergird our democratic system. The individual panels scheduled today and tomorrow will look at transformations in the structures of media and politics, at how political trends have influenced the overall press-politics dynamic, at the specific issue of how religion is covered in the news, and the changing landscape of formats and organizational innovation. Several more keynote sessions also await us at noon today with Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist Ron Suskind, and at 3:30 with the trailblazing journalist Charlene Hunter-Galt. Tomorrow, Friday at noon, there will be a closing session with Emmy Award-winning journalist Maria Hinojosa. I'd like to express the Clough Center's gratitude to our on-campus partners, the Winston Center on Leadership and Ethics, the Institute for Liberal Arts, the BC Journalism Program, Center for Centers, for all their support. And thanks to all of you from the Clough Center for making the effort to be here. And now please join me in welcoming the first panelists to frame the issue of journalism's role in democracies, moderated by WBUR host Tiziana Deering. Thank you.
Actually, I'll start here for just a second. Wonderful to be here. Thank you for having us. I also want to give a shout out to the tote bags. I come from public radio where that's an actual form of currency. And I will say that is a pretty cool tote bag, so thank you very much. I will also confess, it's been a bit of a scrambled couple of days with what's happening on our live show, and I didn't realize I was doing the speaker introductions. So I don't have my material up right in front of me to introduce Barbie and Jan. So we're going to let Barbie and Jan introduce themselves as we come up.
You could introduce each other.
That'd be great too. But I think what we could do is come to the table, we'll have a seat, we'll do the introductions, and then each of you can do your opening remarks. Great, thank you. And Barbie, I'm going to have you do your remarks first, so if you want to sit on the outside and put Jan
Do you want us
in
to
the
sit
middle.
or do you want us to stand?
That's up to your comfort.
Excuse me, I have a coughing fit from having walked up all of those steps hurriedly because I was late. Not the fault of the person who helped me. So I'm Barbie Zelizer. I'm director of the Center for Media at Risk and the Raymond Williams Professor of Communication at the Annenberg School for Communication, and that's at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm a former journalist. I used to work for Reuters in the Middle East, but I left journalism in order to focus on what bothered me about being a journalist. So I have really, over multiple years and multiple books, focused on that question. I typically look at culture, crisis, memory, and images, and I try to do so in a way that not only focuses on what is happening now, but how those practices have changed and improved, hopefully, and unimproved over time. So I'm going to get started. I'm going to get my water and my tea and hope that one of them
And why don't I give you a high sign when you've got about 2 minutes left?
So do you want us still to go for the
10. Yeah,
Okay.
easily.
I thought we were going to steal some extra minutes. Okay. All right. So only start telling me now, please.
Okay, I promise.
Okay.
I promise. That's fair.
I am delighted to set the scene this morning, especially following, I think, Jamal's and Heather's conversation and Jamal's invigorating but depressing talk. And I want to really borrow from something, a theme that he suggested of asking the wrong question. But I want to take it in a different direction. When we talk about enhancing the journalism democracy link, we often hear of federal subsidies and more media literacy and different legal protections, all of which are important and deserve our attention. But I want to argue that none of them are going to save journalism unless we correct what's wrong inside. So I want to begin our talks by setting one thing on the agenda that I see as the fundamental challenge to journalism's role in democracy, and that's journalism's irrelevance. Irrelevance is challenging or sinking institutions in democracies or democratic-leaning regimes in many places around the globe. And that's because institutions were built with a particular imaginary, a particular kind of context in mind, liberal democratic systems of the global north, where everyone presumably plays fair, where facts and truth are equally revered by all players in the game, where political culture excludes journalists and necessarily works through symmetry, where difference is settled by compromise. These assumptions, which exist very fleetingly, if at all, presume a lot about the contexts where journalists work and how they should respond. That institutions are central and cohesive, or they're autonomous and permanent, right? They're there for the long run. All qualities that make an institution authoritative over time and are important for democratic functioning. Or we hear that journalism exists to keep democracy healthy, a role helped along by its embrace of occupational and professional guidelines. But I want to say that these assumptions are leaps of faith. They look better on paper than they do in the world because they do not describe ground conditions. Not only is this because democracies are failing at an alarming rate and democratic backsliding exists in every continent, but because they offer journalists an aspirational model for behavior that distances them from the realities they report in and about. and this lets journalists continue to presume their relevance, even in the case of mounting evidence to the contrary. This is a problem because many of the values and practices that journalists use to mark their occupational identity and professionalism are the very things that make them irrelevant. And I'll give you just a short list from my head. Outdated norms, and here I would include objectivity and balance, sourcing practices that are too close for independent judgment, a reliance on elites that distances journalists from the many publics out there, simplistic and dramatic storytelling that doesn't pay enough attention to structural causes, a tendency toward deference and moderation that silences solidarity, and an overuse of safeguards, and I think you'll recognize all of these, like both siderism, false equivalences, understatement, qualification, and euphemism. And finally, a hugely problematic resistance to change. So I lied. I think maybe that's a long list. But either way, it gives journalists a kind of head-in-the-sand quality that fosters a lot of the problems that we're seeing today. And everything that worries us, right? Newsroom shuttering or a diminishing labor force that's multitasking beyond its ability to cope. The alarming rate of public distrust in journalism that increases the younger you go, and the undoing of local journalism, which is arguably engaged in the best newsmaking out there, right? The newsmaking that has the most relevance, but has the least prestige and is receiving the least amount of funding. None of these can get set right until journalism cleans its own house. All of this is important because democracy cannot exist without journalism. What journalism provides, and we can certainly talk about that in the Q&A, is still pivotal, even when it competes with information flows that supersede conventional notions of who a journalist might be. So how do we make journalists relevant again? The obvious answer to me is to change occupational and professional mindsets, to reset toward values and practices that see journalism as a force for change rather than a relic of continuity. And I want to draw a bit from a recent book that I wrote with Pablo Boskowski and Chris Anderson called The Journalism Manifesto, where we looked at journalism's irrelevance through three main carriers: elites, norms, and audiences. And we argue that we need to change our thinking about each of these three ideas if journalism is to survive. So elites first. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but journalism as it's practiced today is way too elitist for its own good. There's a reason elites aren't faring well in democracies, in declining institutions, and that's because they've played an outsized role at the expense of citizenship and citizenry. And we have theories for addressing this, and they're not new, right? We know that the agreement or disagreement of elites shapes coverage far more than public opinion. We know that elites allow topical debate under very constrained conditions. Pablo, Chris, and I argue that elites have helped journalism cheerlead liberal democracy as an end rather than a means to an end, and that this goes a long way toward positioning journalism as an assist for democracy at the expense of all else that it does. So, norms. They're a challenge because they exist pretty much on unmarked territory. We don't typically kind of challenge them or think about them. And they're articulated mostly when they're under threat. And that should tell us a whole lot about how thin of a concept norms actually is. Norms privilege the ideal over the practical, and though they are thought to inspire people to come together in some kind of organized fashion, they leave a whole lot of people out, engendering racism and sexism and misogyny, class bias, homophobia, and other forms of oppression. The poorly defined and unrepresentative collectivity that norms keep in place hides a world behind the powerful in the liberal democracies of the global north that journalism should be charting. Audiences, we've taken them way too much for granted. We've both assumed they'll always be there for the news and that we know who they are, and neither assumption is correct. The massive exodus from the news to other kinds of content production is our best evidence. Audiences are more tribal, emotional, expressive, and skeptical than they used to be, and they are letting us know quite clearly that journalists need to earn trust. It just doesn't belong to them. So how do we write all this? In our book, we have a reformist view and a revolutionary view. They differ in the way to go about change, but they agree on what needs to change. The reformist view proposes hard tweaking of what we've already got. The revolutionary view suggests tossing it aside in order to reset from anew. Both suggest getting rid of the narrowed positionality that democratic liberalism affords journalists today, and this means moving away from its tacitness, its exclusionary and elitist nature, its fierce embrace of norms that don't matter, and its distancing of audiences, and replacing it with a more explicit and inclusive democratic liberalism that privileges and performs a respect for difference and alternative points of view. And we can imagine lots of possibilities here. A system where elites count for less and community members, especially marginalized community members, count for more, or maybe even a system where elites don't count at all. Instating norms that work from the ground up and that matter regardless of how much they reflect democratic liberalism. One example might be normative workarounds to things like impunity or censorship in mixed political regimes. Another might be norms like social justice or the kind of cosmopolitanism that sees difference not as a disruption, but as a necessary mark of collectivity. And finally, we need to take the audience seriously, abandoning professional distance and meeting audiences where they are instead of where journalists want them to be. To close, we need to break open the box in which we think about how journalism and democracy come together. Our presumption that democracies can't exist without journalism has led us to assume the opposite, that journalism can't exist without democracy. But that is mistaken. Some form of journalism is everywhere, even where democracies don't thrive. And because democracy and autocracy are less distinct from each other than we want, we have to expand our understanding of what journalism looks like in all of its political permutations. We need models of institutions as settings for organizing disorder, not order. We need models of newsmaking that can work with instability, tentativeness, uncertainty, and impermanency as a given on the way to change. The status quo is no longer an option. Thanks.
See, I was going to go ahead and let you just burn it out after all, but you did it in 10 minutes, so we were in great shape. Would you like to go ahead?
So this is a very hard act to follow, but I think our talks might in the end nicely complement each other. I am, in line with a manifesto, which I for a long time had, am not going to introduce myself, because I believe we should abolish introductions entirely. Who cares how many prizes in elementary school somebody may or may not have won, especially in the age of certain devices, even handheld devices, which can help those who might be curious about or confused about somebody who's pontificating really is. I think we should just basically launch right away into whatever we might have to say. So here goes. Partly because I'm not really a journalism scholar at all, and because I was slightly worried when Jonathan posed the question about the role of journalism in democracy that I was simply going to repeat, sort of civic education pieties, I thought I slightly turned the question around and more indirectly tried to get at some of the functions of journalism and democracy by offering something more diagnostic. Namely, let's look more closely at what aspiring autocrats, or for that matter, practicing autocrats, tend to do when they, as the phrase tends to go after the media. I developed these thoughts against two background assumptions. One is that autocracy in the 21st century is not your grandfather's dictatorship from the 20th century. I think a very useful book that some of you may have already seen came out last year called Spin Dictators by our colleagues Sergei Guriev and Daniel Treisman. They contrast what they call spin dictators in the 21st century with fear dictators from the old times in the 20th century, where they essentially argue that today autocrats want to avoid situations where both domestic and international audiences are too easily reminded of images of dictatorships, let alone totalitarianism, from the 20th century. So it's all about controlling public opinion for sure, making sure that no real changeover in power is possible, but also finding ways of not making things too obvious. Now, that doesn't mean that this is a unidirectional or homogeneous development. When they were writing the book, they still had a story about Putin, for instance, saying, look, he does tolerate, a little bit of liberal journalism on the side, very similar to, let's say, Orban in Hungary, whenever you criticize his government, they would say, look, let's take you to, these bloggers who can really criticize us to their heart's content, and look how much internet traffic they're getting, and so on. Obviously, as we've seen in Russia, that can change very rapidly and very, very easily. But I think the overall thesis holds that what autocrats do today when they deal with the media is different from all-out repression as it was known in the 20th century. Secondly, the very term, the media, is of course far too large and not really very helpful when we think about these developments. What is the media anyway? As my colleague Joe Stevens in Princeton sometimes puts it, if an alien arrives on Earth and says, take me to the media, well, where exactly do you go? What is it? So in line with that insight, what I propose to do, drawing somewhat on the thought of Jay Rosen, is to disaggregate the media into 4 distinct levels and try to convince you that aspiring autocrats do different things on these different levels. And that is helpful to understand how the tactics and strategies look different on these 4 levels. Number 1, individual journalists and their ethos, within which, in my view at least, there can be legitimate variety of how people understand their profession. What we've seen, and I'm not telling you anything remotely new, is basically attacks on journalists as biased, as elitist, as conspiring with nefarious global forces, all with the intention of ideally making journalists obey in advance. Or again, if I may pick up a useful distinction from Jay Rosen, basically replacing truth-seeking with refuge-seeking. So to insulate yourselves from the usual charges, you're just biased, you're just a left-wing liberal, etc. You basically, and you all know this of course very well, you go for both sidesism. You go for what you've learned in J school in terms of, but look, I'm objective, I'm not doing anything wrong, this is all according to the right textbook. Maybe less obviously, these sorts of attacks also make what I think at least is a legitimate variety of a professional journalistic ethos, ranging from reporter to advocate. Notice this is not the same as journalism versus activism, basically making that spectrum impossible as well, through attacks on credibility, through attacks that say this is all entirely partisan, and so on. So this all happens mostly at an individual level, and as we've seen in this country and elsewhere, it can be highly, highly effective. Second level, the press as a collective actor, but including, of course, radio, TV, and also online social media. So now not individual journalists, but a kind of collective body where aspiring autocrats have very often done one or more of the following things. First, a strategy of divide and rule. This was, in a sense, sort of blatantly obvious if you think back to these Trump press conferences during times of COVID, when he would basically sort of pick on individual journalists, say, well, you're not legitimate, but you are. And there was a big question at the time, were others going to sort of stand up in solidarity and kind of affirm the role of the press as a collective actor with a collective shared ethos, or were people sort of, going to abandon each other and fall victim to this divide and rule strategy? Beyond that, we've seen that many autocrats think they can simply ignore the press. If you think about the number of people who have been in government sometimes for decades and who simply refuse to hold regular press conferences. This is true of Orban, this is true of Modi. Modi has great things like this sort of thing he had on CNN where he basically was celebrated pretty much in the same way that his biopic, Made in Bollywood, celebrated him. But anything that would look like, a sort of standard setting where the ruler justifies, well, in this case, usually himself, not herself, is simply not taken on anymore. And that is in a certain way also a way of saying, you, the press as a collective, is really considered illegitimate or irrelevant in a certain way. And lastly, and here I would slightly disagree with Barbie, maybe also with a view to maximizing conversation later on. Yes, it's become a standard tactic too, to say that in the broader sense, liberal professionals are elitist and disconnected from the people. But what I would insist on is that certainly right-wing populists are very selective in the kinds of elites they criticize. So if you just think back to, the Trump cabinet, people at the time rightly said, so this is the people's government? Share, all together, you add everything up, $4 billion in net worth, that's the people. But notice how that cabinet was characterized not least by the fact that these were never really professionals. Professionals as in people who might claim authority on the basis of a special kind of education, as in, people tell you what to do on the basis of knowledge, in the way that doctors, lawyers, and maybe sometimes journalists do. These guys, of course, had made their money very honestly on Wall Street, and it was simply a matter of effort. And nobody said, oh, that's horribly, horribly elitist among the relevant audiences. Okay, that's the second level. Third level is the world that usually is captured when people, or try to be captured when people talk about the importance of media pluralism. Media pluralism, at least from my point of view, is the term that, of course, everybody agrees on as a normative demand, yet nobody can define what exactly it is. What many, many aspiring autocrats have obviously done is to not only go after individual journalists, not only go after the press as a collective actor, but to go after the actual institutions that are news media organizations in one form or another. Of course, not all media are news organizations. And again, with a view to the different kind of autocracies that we face today, basically find roundabout ways of capturing them. So in Turkey, I think it's well known that basically Erdogan's oligarchs are also the ones who kept on taking over various media organizations. In Hungary, this is a well-known process. All of a sudden, an Austrian investor comes along who nobody had ever really heard of before, buys up the last major newspaper that, I wouldn't say opposition newspaper because that's in a sense a misdescription. It was simply one that was still daring to be more critical. And then, of course, for entirely innocent financial reasons, has to end up closing it. So this is all part of a playbook where, again, you don't make things too obvious, but you ultimately, on this third level, also attack the kind of institutional infrastructure. Lastly, even beneath that structure, I'm not telling you again anything new, is a kind of technological infrastructure. And if you can capture that, of course, that's even better than capturing all these other levels. The one that, of course, today is most often talked about is social media. I think the mistake that many of us keep making is to kind of fall back into a certain kind of technological determinism, the kind of determinism that has been around with every media revolution. Printing gives us religious civil wars, which is kind of true, but they also give us many other things. Of course, radio gives us Hitler, TV gives us McCarthy, and Facebook gives us fascism, Trump, etc., etc. And what, of course, is often overlooked is that very often what we really are talking about is not technology as such, but very particular business models. So everybody knows that basically Facebook's business model is optimizing for outrage, but that's not social media as such. And less obviously, and that's the last point I want to make, what is often overlooked is that at a certain point, people make what my colleague Paul Starr, in his great book about the creation of the media, call constitutive choices, such that you basically say, okay, is the telegraph going to be privatized or not? And how are cables going to be developed, and so on. Once these constitutive choices have been made, they're extremely hard to reverse. And that's why we see at this most basic level, systemic variation between different countries. And if autocrats can somehow capture that from their point of view, I think would be the most effective of all. So I'll leave you on this very happy note, and I look forward to questions, discussion, and
I'm just going to grab this mic so everybody can just use it. And for those of you who may be wondering, Susan Glasser was unwell and unable to join us for the panel this morning. So I appreciate the opening remarks. Much for us to talk about. It's an interesting thing to observe because there's a tremendous amount of wisdom and urgency and grief, right, in hearing what you have to say. I'm also mindful that that means that, and I actually say this with some humor, I work at the intersection of irrelevance and low prestige and obey in advance, right? So as an individual working in this space, taking in those criticisms, thinking about them and how they play out in the daily life of local journalism is an interesting dimension as well. I'm just going to start with a couple of sort of questions in the space of your comments. And I think I'll start with you, Jan. You talked about the lack of making oneself available to the press, and how that is not a function, but a feature of autocracy. It has been my and I think our experience over the last several years that is true for anybody who feels that they've got a direct line to their constituents. That I might find it as hard, and let me say in advance, I am in no way comparing, let's say, Ayanna Pressley to an autocrat, but she doesn't have to come on the show. She doesn't have to talk to a reporter because she's got a social channel and she can work it there. So, how do we process the idea that that can be an autocratic behavior that fits within this context of journalism and democracy, but it can also just be the disintermediation that anybody with a powerful voice through this technological layer that you're talking about now has access to use? Do you understand my question?
I think I do.
All right.
So, first of all, I think it's an important point in general, also maybe against the background of what we heard last night, that maybe some things really are new. And that now you can basically mobilize people with social media that allows individual actors to dispense with what would have been traditional forms of mobilization in democratic politics, by which I mean either a more or less bureaucratized political party that mobilizes people, or, on a less savory note, clientelism. If you think of someone like Bolsonaro, who at one point was in office and had no party whatsoever, I mean, he cycled through, I think, by now 8 or 9 or so, it's clear that you can do things which you simply couldn't do before. So I think that's important in terms of not going too far down the line of, oh, nothing's really changed from the 19th century. In answer to your actual question, I would say, first of all, we can criticize both. I mean, both, in a sense, are doing something that is problematic from the point of view of democratic citizenship, that you basically don't make yourself available for a certain kind of critical questioning. Now, this goes to Barbie's point that, it's very nice to assert these norms, but if people don't believe them, or if relevant audiences say, but look, it's so much more fun to, connect directly with people and so on, then that doesn't do terribly much. Still, I think it remains important to remind us of the norms, and just as much as autocrats for a while were learning, if I may put it so broadly, from us in terms of, look, I know what their expectations are. This goes back to something Jonathan said at the beginning. Orban knew how the EU works, okay? So it was very easy to say, look, you come with all your checklists, rule of law and so on. I know how to game this because I know how this works. And by the time that you realize what's really going on, 4 or 5 years have passed and the facts on the ground have been established, etc. Now it's a bit different because now and that was partly what I was trying to do, maybe, for better or for worse, now we also have a chance to see how they work in a way that was not true 12 years ago. So when Orban comes on the scene again as Prime Minister in 2010, many people said, oh, these things can't really happen, totally impossible, you're kidding, or maybe one bad apple, and so on. Nobody would say that today. So in that sense, I think it's not a hopeless thing to say, look how this norm is bound up with democracy in a particular way, and it should be a major warning signal if you basically have figures who refuse to confront the press, or who have handpicked journalists, where they will do one supposed radio interview per week. So I know it's a weak answer in terms of how much is that going to do, but I think it's not entirely trivial, given where we were, again, let's say 12, 15 years ago, in terms of saying, look, we have a more refined sense now of how they work and what, in a sense, we need to keep emphasizing.
Barbie, would you like to add to that before I ask you my first question to you?
I would, thank you. I mean, I think that it's worth thinking about how you just phrased the question, because I think when you're saying that here you've got what would otherwise be associated with autocracies right in the midst of democracies, that's the issue, and regardless of intermediation. I mean, I think that what power does, right, is it dissolves. It makes itself invisible. And so if it makes itself invisible, it's on us to figure out where it's lying, where it's hiding. And so I think, I agree with the issue, but I think you're actually giving evidence to the fact that we can't, to what I was arguing, which is that you cannot just look at democracies within the rubric of democracies. And one other thing that I'd like to say is, and this I'm kind of pulling from something that you said, Jan-Werner, which is we talk about the media as being too indeterminate a term. That is correct, because the term should be journalism, right? So we've lost the connection between the media and journalism as a body, right, that has particular values and particular beliefs. And that's why when power dissolves and when power goes invisible, journalism disappears right into the media, and we can't quite track, right, what needs to be put in the forefront.
So my first question to you, and again, just kind of pulling from the comments to ask some curiosity questions to start. And Jan, you made reference to Barbie's comments about norms, and that's where I want to start. And I'm interested to ask you to comb out our norms versus relatively recent attempts by at least some in journalism and reporting to create codes of ethics that begin to deal with the moment that we're in today, everything from how you participate or don't in a protest to what your ethical obligations are in terms of ensuring that you're including community voice in your reporting, et cetera. Are they similar? Are they adjacent? Are they the same? Does one lead to the other? Is that naive? I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Well, if I could say, historically, for the decades I've been analyzing journalism, there are two issues that I've been traumatized by. One is norms and the other is ethics. So you're going to get more of the same, but I think that, there is a continuity between the two. I think that the issue with ethics is even more severe, because ethics, again, are about a kind of tops-down, aspirational, idealistic understanding of what journalists should do, even situated ethics, right, which is the most grounded of the various ways in which we kind of work ethics into an operating system. But ethics don't, what they do is they situate standards that journalists cannot actually realize. And I look at this mostly in terms of photojournalists and the ways in which photojournalists need to take pictures. They are always falling short of the ethical standards that are in place. And so we have to start asking, what is the noise that is being caused by this incessant repair to ethics, the incessant also repair to norms, if we are constantly and continually ranking journalists as under the standard.
So what does one do with that?
I think that we need to develop a system of evaluating journalists in terms of what they do. We need to look at all the kind of workarounds, the kind of hesitant arrangements. Not assume that there are a set of arrangements that are good across all situations. And if we don't start doing that, we're never going to be able to close the gap between what we think in our heads and what's going on in the ground. Look, I think of it. Again, let me get back to images, because that's really where my own research lies. The incorporation of photojournalists into the journalistic world has always been a problematic one, right? Photojournalists have had to kind of compete for attention. They've always been kind of second-class citizens. the fact that that is still the case now, when we are in more of an ocular-centric world than we ever were before, boggles the imagination, right? And it's because all along the way, from the very beginning, when images became part of news, nobody looked at what photojournalists were doing on the ground. And so they're kind of a side story. And they continue to be a side story despite the fact that we probably have more people attending to pictures and attending to images than we do having attended to actually what is written, what is the written word.
Do you want to add anything to that before?
Again, in the interest of avoiding the usual impression that, oh, this is just liberal elites talking to each other, agreeing about everything, slight disagreement. So yes, certainly people fall short of ethics all the time. Maybe most of us do, but I don't think we usually conclude from that we should sort of entirely abandon talk of ethics or the aspiration. And I would have thought, and maybe this is very old-fashioned, that in order to make the work of journalists, to pick up Honora O'Neill's term, accessible for audiences, one needs to give some kind of guidelines. And the fact that then people fall short, is maybe to be lamented. But at least people need some kind of orientation. And if I simply were to say, look, here's a professional, just look at what they do. You could never do that with, I know the parallel doesn't work terribly well, but still, you could never do this with a lawyer or a doctor and say, let's just observe what they do, and then we can sort of figure out what to roughly expect. As opposed to, this is sort of, the kind of realm in which they're supposed to operate, and very often they fall short. They can't guarantee the outcomes. No doctor can guarantee that, the operation will necessarily go well, but we kind of know how to orient ourselves. And I'm not sure about sort of basically saying that sort of whole project is just naive or illusionary.
Well, if I could just clarify a little bit. I'm not saying that people shouldn't engage in ethical behavior. What I'm saying is that once we instate ethical standards, that creates the kind of noise between how they act and how they should act. And again, I mean, I'm not arguing that people should just go out there and do whatever they want. But I think that if whatever they want or whatever they are doing is not being accounted for, there's a problem with what we're using to assess it.
So I'd like to move into a little bit of a different direction. I had come in thinking I was going to talk or ask some questions around objectivity. Understanding A, that that's part of the conversation that happened last night, and B, that we may come back to it. I'm gonna frame it a little bit differently. And I spent the evening actually at a different journalism event last night because I had some colleagues who'd been nominated for an investigative journalism prize. So I spent the evening there. And there were lots of conversations among journalists and publishers, et cetera, around objectivity and the norms of today, et cetera. And a question that began to emerge for me, and I was thinking about as you two were talking again this morning, is I'd actually like to talk about cynicism instead, and two dimensions of cynicism. There is the cynicism that is the natural role, I think, of the journalist and reporter, which is to not take things at face value, to make sure that, especially in investigative journalism, that we are digging below the surface and making sure that there's accountability, that what people are saying is the actual truth, et cetera. And then there is the cynical use of the layers of media that you talked about, that is, if I can put my own opinion forward for a moment, deeply plaguing our ability to pursue legitimate reporting and legitimate journalism. So I'm thinking last night about Judy Woodruff on Zoom because she also was sick and not able to make the event. That's something that seems to be going around, talking about the extent to which we now know, for example, that there were Fox News figures who knew one thing and were deliberately saying another because they were cynically pursuing ratings, right? So two kinds of cynicism at play in journalism, one that makes you a good journalist and one that helps dismantle the system. And how do we think about the pursuits of cynicism against the pursuits of objectivity and what role they play? That is my open question, and you should feel free to take it anywhere you want, because you may not want to pick it up and go where I was going with it, but it's something that's on my mind very much as a practitioner.
Can you just say a little bit more what you mean by the tension between cynicism and objectivity?
So I think the tension is between cynicism and cynicism, actually. And where it then comes into play in objectivity is if you present as objective that which you are pursuing with the type of cynicism that, and I'll use Fox News again as an example, that a Fox News is doing, versus you're pursuing objectivity with the type of cynicism that says, I can't just both and this, because this is not both and. And a smart, cynical look at this will recognize this is not both and. Those are very different things.
Can I start? I'm curious about the choice of cynicism. I mean, I would, and maybe this is the Midwestern gal in me, right? When I think about what journalists, how journalists engage attitudinally, I think about skepticism. I think about curiosity. I don't think that cynicism is actually, I think that if cynicism is part of the initial setting, there's a problem. So I guess
I welcome the, right?
Okay.
So this is to get you to react. I welcome that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so if I can talk about skepticism and objectivity, I think that perhaps is more of the issue. And is Jamel here? No, he's not. Okay. So one of the things he said last night was, he said there was a blip. There was only a very short period between the 1930s up until the 1970s when objectivity reigned, 1960s and 70s, and then when all the the question authority moment came, everybody kind of began to say, oh, no, objectivity really can't work anymore. I would say that that's not a correct assumption. I think that objectivity reigned for about the period of the Second World War. And that immediately after the Second World War, we had the Cold War. So we had a kind of default setting, right, by which objectivity was no longer a thing. It was a claim made to uphold a larger belief system, right? That America was supreme, that America was a world power, that America was, righting the world in service of democracy. So even the examination of objectivity, I think, is so much smaller than what we give it credit for. It's not just that it's a blip on the historical imagination, and we have to keep asking why we are constantly hearkening back to it. And I think that we are hearkening back to it because we assume that cynicism is part of the picture. And so, once we've given a slightly more demoralizing label to acts of curiosity, acts of honest investigation, acts of skepticism, we need something larger, right, to kind of constitute the other side of the frame.
3 quick points. So I think, with all due respect, the Fox example is kind of irrelevant in terms of, these are cynical journalists, because they're not journalists at all. Secondly, again, I'm picking up a term from Jay Rosen, there is the savvy style, which kind of comes across as sort of self-consciously cynical in terms of, I know how this game works, you naive readers, I'm going to sort of tell you what the moves are and how smart DeSantis is being again and so on. And I think by now we've learned that, this can do a lot of damage. It's not false, it's just sort of making us focus on the wrong issues. And again, to the extent that we want journalists to reinforce certain very basic democratic standards, which basically also means journalists have to become democratic theorists, God forbid, this sort of pulls in the wrong direction. Thirdly, all this talk of people are less trustful and maybe people are more cynical and less engaged and so on, I generally would like to see some more evidence of that. I mean, this is always sort of the default option for, dare I say it now myself, liberal elites. That somehow there is a problem with the people. They're less trustful, they're more gullible now. I mean, after 2016, all the kinds of things from, basically 19th century mass psychology, which you couldn't say in polite company anymore. People are so irrational, they're always ready to be seduced by the great demagogue and so on, became completely okay to say again. And maybe Pippa Norris will say more about this, but you can't in a blanket way say people are less trustful. Of course, those who believed in conspiracy theories around COVID, for instance, they did trust somebody, just not the right people, so to speak. And we have to explain why exactly that happened. And, also going back to something that was said last night, I find it highly implausible to say that January 6th is somehow an outcome of cynicism. These people were not cynical. We can call them all kinds of things and try to make sense of what they were doing. But to say that this is sort of a almost Hannah Arendt-style claim about people are getting isolated and disengaged and so on, I find all that pretty misleading. And in that sense, I maybe like Barbie, I think cynicism might not get us very far as a contemporary diagnostic tool.
So, as a way to pull out fascinating comments from you, I think it worked well. Those were very helpful. It is interesting to engage with the two of you in what feels like a bird's eye look, right, across journalism, especially because, and I'll put some of my cards on the table, I, at this stage in my career, hold such a fundamental belief that there really is a difference between local journalism and other forms of journalism. And that difference is the ability to deeply connect on the ground with people who are living their daily lives. Understand how they're experiencing and pursuing those daily lives, what is plaguing and making those daily lives difficult, what questions they have in order to be able to better fulfill their daily lives, et cetera. And I wonder how the two of you see the power or the failure, you pick, right? I know which one I think, right? But the power or the failure of local journalism in this mix, and how we situate that with sort of the liberal elite level. And not that I don't think we can have a liberal elite layer even in the most local, right? I'm duly aware. But how do we think of that piece?
Look, there's a reason local journalism works best. I mean, local journalism embodies the ideals connected with democracy, right? I mean, you've got the people, you've got the government, they know each other. I mean, Jamel's discussion last night of, finding out, I thought he was going to say that he knew how many. There was one example he gave, and he said, I even found myself going there. I can't remember what it was. But I think that the fact that it works best and is privileged the least, that's the headline, right? Like that's where we need to be focused. So there's no question that we need to build up local journalism, and all of those solutions that I mentioned in the beginning, particularly subsidies, more media literacy, new legal protections, those should be enacted first on local journalism. I mean, there's no question. However, we have to figure out why it is that there is such a disconnect between journalism on the national level and journalism on the global level, and journalism on the local and regional level. And we know so much of this. This has to do with business models, but clearly that has not infiltrated enough. And I think that it's kind of like in the educational system. If you don't correct the primary school educational curriculum, you can't really worry about the universities. Same thing.
I completely agree. One caveat, you didn't say that, again, goes back more to what we heard last night. I would not sort of go from this thought to saying that local politics will then necessarily be somehow less conflictual. It's true that nationally we have real polarization entrepreneurs. This has turned out to be hugely profitable. Again, it's sort of a model that can be copied very easily in other countries. But maybe also as a salutary reminder that democracy is about conflict. And there's nothing wrong if people have divergence in interests, identities, even ideas, and so on. Anybody who's ever had a dispute with their neighbor would not say that, local is always more peaceful. But as long as, to put it very crudely, as long as people operate on the basis of the same facts, and as long as they don't deny each other standing, so they don't say, you don't really belong here, go back to your shithole country, to coin a phrase, we can resolve conflicts in certain ways that actually strengthen democracy, because people affirm each other's role as legitimate members of the polity or the local town or wherever they're operating, and they also ultimately affirm shared facts, which, among other things, has the side effect that we can always go back to the outcome of a conflict and say, let's revisit the issue. You can't do that if you have nothing in common. If you tell me, climate is the Chinese are causing it, we can resolve certain things seemingly in a certain way, but it makes no sense really to revisit the issue as long as that sort of underlying sense of what's really at stake, what's the truth of the matter, is so much in dispute itself. I know that this is very crude, very broad, etc. But I think it's important, because if we sort of set ourselves up for saying, it's only going to be democracy if we all become more civil and all get along and have nice neighborhood meetings and so on, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment, because it's not going to be like that.
Which brings us back to the whole question of community building, right? Like, we have dropped that out of what journalism is supposed to do. We just have, and this brings us all the way back to the famous debate that never happened between Walter Lippmann and John Dewey, right? Which is, what is journalism about? Is it about informing, or is it about bringing people together? Is it about community building, or is it about being an information broker? That we have lost sight of the second. And so when we say that, I totally agree that, democracy is about conflict. Conflict should not be a dirty word. But we live in a kind of ideological mindset where we have taken so many concepts and kind of, thrown them to the side because they don't fit where we think we need to go. And conflict is one, revolution is another. There are there's a whole line of things that we have taught ourselves not to consider. And I think that it has worked very much to the disadvantage of journalism.
I think it would be a good time to begin to open this up. Eric.
Thank you both. Really interesting talks, and thank you for being here today. I'm really interested, we've been hearing a lot already just in 12 hours of talking about local journalism, valorizing local journalism as potential panacea for our problems, or identifying it as a cause of some of our problems, et cetera, et cetera. I'm wondering if you might say a bit about the role of the global in local journalism. What's the relationship, if we are to be focusing on local journalism, and if it is this important, both diagnostically and in terms of an assist to democracy? What's the role of the global? What's the responsibility? What's the relationship that you see in the local coverage, actualities, recovery, et cetera?
That's a great question. And it's a great question because I'm thinking most of our habits are such that you look at, for instance, I get 3 papers a day. One of them is local, one of them is national, and one of them claims to be National Plus. And so and the National Plus, of course, is the New York Times, and it kind of includes all the global. And, so I myself dissociate where I look for global news. But of course, you're absolutely correct, right? That the global should be in local news, and not just in terms of giving the global more of a local angle, right, which is usually how it's covered, but as a way of kind of modeling different kinds of communities to each other. I think that there is a downside when local journalism only looks at local issues, but the issue also is that if they don't look at local issues, who's going to? So I think there's a tension there, but I think it's a tension that could be really productively teased out.
It's a great question, which is a euphemism for I don't have a super original answer. But I would reaffirm what Barbie said a bit earlier, that it's very important to tell stories that point to structural factors. And a lot, of course, what happens locally ultimately will have clear links with certain global developments. And somebody who can do this well in terms of saying, look, here are the local effects of what seems impersonal forces that we're all kind of subject to, I think that's a major achievement. And again, that sort of pushes back against what I think Jamal was rightly warning about, that sort of if you have this vacuum of local journalism, sort of culture war bullshit kind of fills the vacuum and can seem very entertaining, attractive, and so on. But ideally, we would kind of link to larger forces in a more explanatory kind of, which doesn't mean professorial, God forbid, but in a more explanatory kind of way that sort of allows people to see the actual forces at work in their daily lives.
First off, thanks very much for both your comments. I have a question that's pegged against something that came out of Jan's comments, but Barbie, feel free to jump in if you like. And it's reflecting on the portion of your talk where you were talking about how autocrats have the tendency to delegitimize journalists and kind of liberal professional elite. And I guess the short version of my question is there a journalistic model for holding populist performance accountable? You described how there was this sort of like acceptance of Donald Trump's cabinet, which was overflowing with wealth, somehow represented a kind of populist force. I would add to that his signature legislative achievement during his 4 years was a tax cut overwhelmingly tilted toward the wealthiest and largest corporations. And I think there's a way in which you may well address this in your book on populism, but there's a way in which populism gets conceived of as class in terms of taste, expertise, and upbringing, as opposed to necessarily economic status. And for journalists, I think to call attention to that hold that accountable almost plays into the trap of them seeming like liberal professional elites, right? So I guess, again, the sort of central question is there a journalistic model for holding populist performance accountable?
We have 3 hours left, no, to answer this very simple, straightforward question.
You get 2 hours.
So 3 points. One is again the one about articulating very clearly what's democratic and what's not democratic. Obviously, these can be broad lines, this can be contested, and so on. But there's some cases where there's not much of a debate. And like others in this room, I would simply say this is part of what it means to be a proper journalist. Now, that only goes so far. Second element would be to say that a lot of these autocrats, of course, don't operate in isolation. And whereas in the old days, which is the 20th century, a lot of the toolkit of so-called democratic self-defense, militant democracy, really operated in national context, I think a new model can operate much more transnationally. What do I mean? Well, when, for instance, the State Department said we have to start funding local journalism in Hungary. Big outcry, of course. Who are you to kind of intervene? There's neo-colonialism and so on. But I think this is basically the right path to go. Not least because, of course, many other countries have built up a global infrastructure of news channels of varying degrees of credibility and reliability and so on. So this kind of transnational intervention and saying, look, we have to finance people who actually tell it as it is. I think is a second point, and then thirdly, and this is maybe more of a cheap shot at journalists, resist the temptation of the simplistic answers. Of course, the conventional wisdom is, populism, they're the ones who have simplistic solutions to a complex world. We, of course, do complexity and so on. That in itself is an incredibly simplistic contrast, and very often, after 2016 or so, the number of times that people sort of just said, how do we explain all this? Somewheres versus anywheres. Let's go to every single Midwestern diner, find a white male who's going to explain everything to us. And a simple look at who actually voted for Trump, simple look at the fact that, and you were kind of hinting at this in the question, that we're not dealing with the people versus elites. We are dealing with two elites opposing each other. What sometimes in Poland is called elite A and elite B. We can, cash it out in ever so many ways: Manhattan versus Queens, rural Hungary versus Budapest, etc., etc. But they're, Black Turks against, Kemalist elite, whatever. I mean, there are a million ways we can sort of describe this in different contexts. But that's a good starting point for saying let's not fall into a trap where we basically confirm their framing. And I mean, this is of course much talked about, but I'll repeat it which is simply that it's something like the Times' recent framing of DeSantis going up against the education establishment. This is the thing where you want to shoot yourself in terms of saying, look, you're doing exactly what they want you to do, and that's just such a basic breach of never mind affirming democratic norms, but simply saying let's carefully think about how we frame a story like this.
Do you want to add to that, Barbie?
I just want to add, be careful of making Midwestern generalizations.
Yes.
No, I think I agree with everything that Jan-Werner is saying, but I think that we have to be a little bit careful when we start thinking about transnational interventions. Transnational interventions, by definition, have particular qualities that make them less about transnationality and more about the kind of export of particular kinds of ideology. That's not to say that we can't intervene, but I think that we have to intervene, that there has to be intervention in a way that is transparent.
Yeah, just one footnote. Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, that's the thing. I was putting this in a very shorthand way. Obviously, and you pointed earlier towards certain Cold War legacies and so on. I'm not saying we have great models, let's just take them off the shelf. Radio Free Europe, everything is already there, we can simply implement that. Absolutely not. And it's very context dependent, like everything else in life. So it's one thing for the EU to say, we're going to send you great journalists from Brussels, or we're going to sort of find good civil society organizations, let's say, on the ground, who we selectively finance, but they're going to do it, of course.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to sort of do it for them.
Other questions from the audience? Hi, go ahead.
I had a question about, I guess, picking up on the idea of communicating a certain complexity to an audience wherever they're at. I think that the framing of that is very much reliant on the actual media form that somebody is engaging with. And I'm wondering, I guess this question is for both of you, what kind of considerations should the journalists or media outlet make for the consideration of complexity as it pertains or is, ran through a particular media form? In my own experience, I think reading is a much more active thing than watching a TikTok or a YouTube video or something like that, or even a short news segment. But that may very well be the way that's, let's say, a working class person who only checks their phone on lunch break or something, catches up on the news, would be a YouTube video or TikTok. So what kind of considerations should be made about the actual forms that media is conveyed?
Well, I think that the whole question of complexity in today's journalistic environment, it's kind of at counter purposes with the ability to actually produce news. I mean, if you've got one person who's multitasking across four different channels, relay channels, it's kind of hard to figure complexity into the story according to the medium. That said, I think that if there were more of a discussion about foregrounding complexity, I think that we would be able to figure out how it would work. But I think you're right that we have, the most people in the public, in the many publics, have learned to think simplistically about the news and have learned to figure out what is the handle, right? What is the least amount of work that they need to do in order to know what's going on. That has to change with media literacy classes, and those media literacy classes should be happening already in primary school. I mean, there's a reason in Finland, right, that they have such a pushback toward disinformation and misinformation. That's because the kids in Finland learn media literacy from the get-go, right? So it's not just on the journalists, it's also on the members of the public.
Jan, do you want to add anything to that?
So this is a really excellent, which is to say, super complicated question. I think it partly depends on what we mean by complexity. Politics is in the business of reducing complexity. If you as a politician can find a very effective symbol about what you are truly about, build the wall, that's a big success. Then the task of journalism, in a sense, is to say it's more complicated, and we have to kind of explain how it's more complicated. But that's not always, the only thing to bear in mind. I know it's much maligned these days. But even if complexity means, okay, people disagree about what causes what exactly, or they might have certain normative disagreements, even the old talking heads going against each other, I think is not per se an illegitimate way of trying to kind of model that and sort of get the point across that, here are certain disagreements about what is happening. And then lastly, a little bit in line with that, I think a lot of what has happened in terms of more interpretive journalism, I would not say is bad. I mean, we don't, even the fact that nowadays when we teach, we say things like, and here's the upshot, it sort of has a reason in a sense, it might not be a bad reason. What I think is problematic, and here I'm echoing our colleague Kaz Mudde, is that sometimes sort of so-called opinion journalism and explainer journalism gets sort of mixed up with each other, and you can't really tell anymore what's what. So was Brad Stevens explaining to us that masks don't work, or was he really sort of voicing a more normative claim about freedom or something else? And that is, I think, something where one could do more in terms of saying, look, let's be absolutely clear about sort of what this is trying to really accomplish. And then people might take different stances on it still. But if it's sort of mixed up in the wrong way, then all of a sudden I can say, but my normative stance is different, and I'm still doing justice to the complexity. Because, hey, it explained to me that, it's like this and this and this, when in fact it was about something else, if that makes sense, as a kind of art of separation, if you like.
Jonathan, shall we still go till 10:30? Shall I take the last 8 or 9 minutes? Great. And right here. Hi.
Hi. Thank you. I'm from Turkey, and I'll say more about this afternoon. It's a very advanced case of the problem of authoritarianism we're speaking about. So the point about foreign funding of the media, I'm thinking through the Turkish example. On the one hand, it makes total sense because here's a regime that suffocates anything that is independent media while lavishly funding its own progress. But on the other hand, I can very well see how they will use it for the next step, which will to totally eradicate that as well, to say that, you see, this is a foreign conspiracy that we've been telling you about. So maybe there can be a difference between state department funding versus independent foundations. They will still put that into all one big Elders of Zion sort of conspiracy, but at least there could be a nuance there, and at least it should be done carefully because that is a part of their narrative, right? I mean, we are actually suffocating these because they're serving the foreign powers and they are the mouthpieces of the imperialists that are targeting our countries.
Yeah, so very clear-cut answer, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that, yeah, this is not a panacea and it has to be handled very carefully and it's extremely context-dependent. No, in the sense that, as you yourself were saying, no matter what outside actors do, the relevant authoritarian populist governments are going to talk about Soros and foreign funding and CIA anyway. So it's not like, depending on the fact of the matter, they're going to change their rhetoric. I mean, you remember that, Gezi Park protests were organized by Lufthansa, right? So I mean, it was, so it doesn't really matter what's sort of happening on the ground. This has become such an effective tool. And again, it has a certain, maybe that's worth adding, it's sort of logic within populism itself, because you basically have to keep pointing at nefarious elites. And once you're in power in your own country, it becomes more difficult to say, why are things not working out? Why do we have all these problems? Well, the obvious default is to say now it's the international elites who are keeping us down, preventing the real people's will from being implemented and so on. So I think partly because of this logic and partly because it's effective, we're never going to prevent, I think, that sort of pushback, no matter what we do or don't do.
Do you want to add anything, Barbie? Other questions?
Very brief one.
Sure.
Okay. In the end of the play, Hamlet asks Horatio to tell his story. This Horatio journalist knows deeply the facts. I would like to ask you if knowing deeply the facts is the main ethical concern of journalism.
If knowing deeply the facts
Is the main concern
of journalism. You got me. The reason why you got me is because, look, yes, knowing deeply what you're writing about is the main concern of journalism. The facts become contestable. I don't think that that's a problem. I think that we have fetishized facts in a way that makes us assume that there's a kind of unitary feel to them. Yes, reality happens, of course. But beyond the fact that reality happens, I think that the facts that we append to explaining what happened depends on one's perspective. So I would just, this is a little bit going back to a comment that Jan-Werner made before, which is, the separation of opinion and fact. I don't think that's possible. I think that whenever you are reporting from your perspective. And I think the fact that, I'm sorry, I keep using the word, the fact that we keep taking opinion and putting it somehow in some kind of a bracket, and taking perspective and somehow assuming that taints or dirties our engagement with what we're talking about, I think that is a problem.
I think there can be, though, a continuum between recognizing that one has a perspective,
Yes.
right? And you can neither deny, and in fact, I would argue you're practicing bad journalism if you don't recognize that you come in with a perspective.
Yes.
But you can stop short of bringing your opinion in to your reporting nonetheless.
Yes, I agree with that. Yes.
Anybody else? So now that we've had this conversation, go back, please, to your opening remarks. And given the questions you've been asked and what you've heard in the room, is there anything more you'd add in the last minute or two from either of you?
I would add that for a panel that is titled Journalism's Role in Democracy, we've talked a lot about autocracy. And I think that that's great. I think that's where we need to be. I think that that's where we need to be in many years coming.
Just add to, in response to the last question. So yes, of course, it's very hard to talk about facts in isolation. The facts don't speak for themselves. None of us has ever heard the facts speak. Some things are not disputable. This is the, by now, maybe very hackneyed example from Hannah Arendt's famous essay on Truth and Politics. No, Belgium did not invade Germany in 1914. Beyond that, yes, of course, you have an interpretive frame of how to make sense of the facts. What I was advocating was more to say that if your primary purpose is to inform, that's a little bit different from your primary purpose being, let's say, to reform. And if you make this clearer at the beginning and say, look, this is driving at a certain change in the world, as opposed to, I'm just going to try to explain as best as I can what might be causing what. And the specific example it's always very easy to beat up on the Times, but the specific example I'm thinking of is that they have now very many opinion pieces, which basically are journalists from Brazil or Germany or some other place that sort of look, let me tell you what's going on in my country right now. And that can be very informative. But it's very strange to put this in an opinion section in a certain way, because usually there is no real opinion that is comparable to what else would be in an opinion section domestically, nor is it really clear, where the line is between informing and reforming in these contexts.
If I can just punch back at you for 1 second, I don't think that the options are between informing and reforming.
Okay.
I think that there are a lot of things that happen alongside informing, and one of the things that really gets back to community building that I think that we have forgotten is that journalism is there also to orient, right? It's there to give options. It's there to offer the kinds of intellectual templates that help us as people, as individuals, reach our own conclusions about what it is we're reading. So I think that the notion of informing as the primary thing that journalism does, or at least the main thing that journalism does, also can be loosened up a bit.
Well, if the purpose, and it is, of a panel like this is to be challenging, to be thought-provoking, to be confronted with sort of the elegance of thinking, I would argue that the two of you have been a wild success. And I want to thank you both for your time, and I want to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for kicking us off this evening. We go to break now, yeah? Great.
I'm not saying informing or reforming are the only
I know,
options.